We use labels and stereotypes to very quickly understand and categorize the world around us. When we're children, we don't have these understandings innately, and so we have to take the information that we receive around us and form judgments that can take quite a long time. In many instances, it's incredibly useful for us to be able to do this, because it would take a huge amount of time to build rapport for people, and we would behave inappropriately to those around us. When we use stereotypes, it allows us to very quickly understand who might be the best person to approach for any given job, and how to modify or mediate our behaviour so that we don't behave inappropriately in a social setting. This is a great example of how stereotyping people can be a very useful function for us in day-to-day life. You don't ask a toddler for directions. You don't ask a very old person to help you move a sofa, and that's because you stereotype. Now, stereotypes then go awry in all sorts of ways, and they cause horrible moral problems and horrible rational problems. But this is because a system that has been evolved to make generalisations in certain circumstances can go wrong in other circumstances. As we can see from this example by Paul Bloom, stereotyping performs an incredibly useful function, because without this, we would find ourselves asking elderly people to do jobs that were physically demanding, or using inappropriate language with children. But with everything else, stereotyping is a sliding scale in terms of the positive and the negative. We find that we stereotype people based on their likes and interests, a good example of which would be hipsters, where we decide that we already know who somebody is, what kind of music they might like, what kind of personal ethics they might have, and the way that they might dress, just because of a few different visual clues. People tend to adopt these visual clues because they like being part of a tribe or a pack, or a psychological crowd, as I've discussed in previous videos. Being part of this tribe allows people to feel like they're part of a larger group, and the issue with that is that when we're part of a larger group, we lose part of our individuality. We trade in this individuality for a sense of validation and feeling as though we belong. But this becomes tricky at the point that we start to lose who we are. And this, for me, is when stereotyping becomes a difficult and problematic thing. As individuals, we like to believe that we have free will. We like to believe that we are individual, we have our own identity, and that we are unique. But when we form part of a social group and adopt visual clues that other people use to judge us, we lose that identity and we lose part of ourselves. The validation that comes with this is a temporary instant gratification, in the same way that getting likes on Facebook will make you feel instantly validated for your behaviour. So whilst being part of a social group makes us feel more validated, makes us feel like we belong, and makes us feel somehow supported by other people around us, it does take away from who we are, and it causes us to behave differently. It also means that we can see that group identity as part of who we are, which may feel true, but if we move outside of that, it's something that allows advertising companies and marketing to take advantage of who we think we are. A company who's done this to great effect is the Apple Computer Company, who has adopted the branding of lifestyle so much that those who feel that they belong to a certain kind of lifestyle, e.g. the hipsters, will buy products spending thousands of pounds purely because they see that brand as representing who they see themselves as. Calling it a lifestyle is a recognition that people who live a certain way choose to incorporate Apple into their lives. Those people use certain products or brands in the course of living in that lifestyle. That is, in part, how we recognise their way of life in the first place. The products they choose become proof of why they do the things they do. I personally find this slightly concerning, that because of the way we see ourselves, and the way that we decide that we are represented, we're willing to allow huge corporations to sell us products based on the identity that they think that we have as individuals. So whilst we have stereotyping and labels within social groups, we all have images that come to mind when we think of blondes or geeks and what kind of attributes those people may have. But this can also have a reverse side, where we defer to people based on how we see them. A very famous example is the Milgram experiment, in which individuals were asked to administer electric shocks to people in another room who, unbeknownst to them, were actors who would be screaming in louder and louder tones as the experiment progressed. It was discovered that people were convinced to hurt other people based purely on the fact that they were being told to do so by a voice of authority in a lab coat. It's not a huge leap to understand how people like the Nazis were able to convince people to do atrocious and terrible things to other people, purely because they had this sense of authority. I'm not saying that all stereotypes and labels are bad. In certain situations, labeling someone can actually enhance their capacity to interact with the world around them. A good example of this is autism, in which a diagnosis will allow someone to understand how best to help educate an individual and help them learn how to interact with other individuals. I personally have an incredibly unusual cognitive disorder that means I'm unable to recognize anyone's face, including those of my family or myself. And finding this out at the age of 18 was of huge benefit for me, because it's helped me to learn other ways of recognizing people, and not to feel bad about the fact that I don't recognize those around me, because it's a cognitive disorder. However, in medical health, we've become very adept at labeling individuals. There has been a recent epidemic in labeling certain mental health conditions, and whilst an awful lot of these will be of huge benefit to the individuals, as it will allow them to feel better and as though they are not to blame for behaviour that they cannot help, there's a sliding scale of where that becomes useful and where it starts to hinder people and make them feel as though they are limited. There has been an enormous spate of diagnosis of childhood bipolar in the United States, and many medical experts believe that childhood bipolar is not a genuine medical condition, as bipolar generally does not manifest until an individual is in their teenage years. There's a sense that any behaviour that deviates from normality or that people find difficult to deal with should be medicated and diagnosed. This level of diagnosis becomes very, very problematic at the point that we decide that anyone who irritates us or is difficult to deal with should be medicated and sedated so that they are no longer a problem to us, which is something we're seeing on a massive scale in the United States at the moment, as more and more children are being medicated for mental health disorders, where in many cases, and definitely not all cases, the children are just stressful and loud and rowdy for their parents, because they have not yet learned how to manage themselves as individuals, as they are emotionally immature. It's incredibly problematic that we are putting these labels onto children, because we're telling them that they are somehow broken, and we're also not giving them the tools emotionally to learn how to manage themselves as they grow up. There has been a recent spate of mental health diagnoses that tell people that just because they are slightly different, or they don't fit into a certain mould, or they react to a situation differently, that they are somehow broken or limited, or that there is something wrong with them. And I do want to stress that there are an awful lot of mental health diagnoses and general health diagnoses that are incredibly helpful and absolutely must be happening, because they will allow people to interact and function within the world around them. But the problem here is when people are being diagnosed and medicated for something that could instead be dealt with long-term management strategies, and without a label that something is wrong with that person. Most of these mental health diagnoses are very new things, and it's interesting to look at how they came about. They came about as the result of a man called Robert Spitzer, who was asked to expand the DSM, which is what they use in America to diagnose and categorize these conditions. Robert Spitzer decided to do this because he was frustrated with Freudian psychoanalysis, as he'd watched his mother go through an awful lot of psychoanalysis and not receive any benefit. He decided to dilute this by adding as many mental health conditions to the book as he possibly could, which all entailed a checklist and a more scientific approach in his eyes. A large group of therapists gathered in a room, and every single one of them stated conditions, and then gave a checklist as to how these could be diagnosed. The only one that was rejected during this time was atypical child syndrome, and this was rejected purely because there was no checklist, as it was felt that an atypical child is an atypical child, and difficult to diagnose on this basis. John Ronson, in his book The Psychopath Test, went to visit Robert Spitzer to understand how he felt about it. And these comments, which I want to end with, are very, very telling. When I asked Robert Spitzer about the possibility that he'd inadvertently created a world in which some ordinary behaviours were being labelled mental disorders, he fell silent. I waited for him to answer, but the silence lasted 3 minutes. Finally, he said, "I don't know." "Do you ever think about it?" I asked him. "I guess the answer is I don't really," he said. "Maybe I should. But I don't like the idea of speculating how many of the DSM categories are describing normal behaviour." "Why don't you like speculating on that?" I asked. "Because then I'd be speculating on how much of it is a mistake," he'd said. There was another long silence. "Some of it may be," he said. Ultimately, we make decisions and we see things in a certain way because of the time we are living in and the way we see things right now based upon the information that we have. But we know through historical references that things change, and in 10 years' time we'll understand things differently. It's very important not to put too much weight onto stereotypes and labels. If they start to impair the way that we interact with the world around us, or they impose boundaries on limitations in what we think we'll be able to achieve as people, and how we may be able to interact with the world around us, we need to question how helpful these diagnoses really are, and only use them when they are of benefit to ourselves and to other people.